Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining us at our last PRISM seminar of the academic year. I'm incredibly excited to welcome Dr. Austin Van Loon. Dr. Van Loon is an assistant professor of work and organization studies at the MIT Sloan School of Management. His research falls into two streams. In one, he studies the role of culture and identity in markets, organizations, and politics. And in the other, he studies how to better integrate tools from artificial intelligence into the social sciences. Also, he's one of my great friends from graduate school, so it's been really nice to have him around. If you are on Zoom, we're going to take questions as we go, but please keep yourself muted. I'll monitor the chat and interrupt Austin as we go. And I look forward to his talk. So let's all welcome Dr. Austin Van Loon.
Thanks for the intro, Clint, and thanks to you all for coming. Thanks everybody over Zoom for logging on. And I guess I have to warn you up front. Daphne told me yesterday that you guys like in-progress work. I'm definitely very much going to deliver on that today. We got the kind of first round of data collection on this, not last week, but the week before. So we're still very much in the kind of first bite of the apple stage on this. But nonetheless, I think we're kind of coming to a kind of coherent story. We're starting to kind of understand what's going on. And so I think it's a good time to kind of check in with other folks and kind of hear that reflected back at us. I should say this work is joined with AJ Alvaro, who is research faculty at Cornell Data Science. And I just want to start by learning how to transition the slides here. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but there's this technology, generative AI, that's kind of making waves. It's starting to become popular, specifically like when we're going to be studying large language models. But in general, this is a technology, typically deep learning driven, that takes in large corpora of content. So for instance, text in the case of large language models, and it has the capability of producing novel content on the basis of patterns it learns in that corpus. And so, sorry if I'm like reviewing stuff we all probably already know, but for instance, large language models take in large corpora from, say, the internet or other kinds of archives of text documents, and then it can produce novel content that's not seen anywhere in that particular corpus, but still holds to, say, linguistic norms and still provides potentially novel information. Now, as technology, as social scientists, as it proliferates, it leaves us with a set of policy-oriented questions and a set of theoretical questions. And on the policy side, each sector of society is going to be greatly impacted by the proliferation of this technology. And so businesses are going to have to grapple with changes to how they hire, changes in their operations, et cetera. But also education, higher education institutions have to deal with how it's impacting, say, how students learn, how we teach, and as we're going to look at today, admissions. And so the hope is that as social scientists, we can help inform some of those discussions by gathering rigorous empirical evidence to test the theories that we might have. I guess here I'd also just like to interject and say that if you start talking to people, for instance, about what's going to be the impact of generative AI on college admissions, I'll tell you, having worked on this project now for a few months, that folks have a lot of ideas. And you can get a lot of competing explanations that to everybody seems obvious. And so it's really important for us as social scientists to step in, actually collect the evidence, actually test the ideas. So I just want to make sure that we're clear on that kind of goal up front. Also, there's a set of theoretical opportunities that are presented by this new technology. And that as this technology proliferates, as it starts affecting different institutions, we can start to leverage that change and that variation that's introduced to start understanding the kind of nature of those social systems at a more fundamental level. And so that's also going to be one of our aims here. And there's many different domains that we could choose to study this in. We're going to be specifically looking at the case of college admissions. And I probably don't have to convince the folks in this room too hard that that's an important context to study, but just in case there are some holdouts, let me just make a connection to three kind of areas that you might also care about. So the first is that college admissions is a key site to understand if you want to understand inequality in society. And that's because in college admissions, we see inequalities in society reproduced, but also in general, it's kind of this key mechanism through which the distribution of social capital or of human capital is shaped in society. And so it's also a key kind of pathway of upward mobility in the US. And so if you care about inequalities, you care about college admissions. Also, if you care about science, the state of science, who's in science, you should also be caring about college admissions, because of course, as we all know, there's quite the funnel. This career path. There's a series of checks that individuals have to go through to end up in, say, an academic job, to be contributing to the progression of science in a professional way. And one of those important checkpoints is college admissions. And then finally, from a social psychological standpoint, at a very individual level, college admissions, admission to college, going through the college experience is this kind of key part of how individuals develop their identity and gain symbolic capital that helps them navigate social situations even outside of educational context. So with this in mind, the kind of proliferation of generative AI presenting these interesting policy questions and theoretical opportunities, and the importance of this particular empirical context, today we're going to be starting to think about this research question. The kind of goal of this overall kind of program is to understand how the proliferation of generative AI among applicants is changing college admissions. And so that's actually a very big question, as we'll talk about. There's many different components we could be interested in. We have done one data collection so far that we think helps us address some parts of that question, but this is the kind of overarching question that we want to understand. So with that kind of motivation in mind, here's the kind of rough agenda for what I'm hoping to get through today. First, we're going to talk about theoretically how we kind of think about this problem. If we approach this analytically, how can we kind of break down the situation to help us give purchase and understand what's going on. And then we'll talk about some data we've collected, some methods that we're going to use to analyze that data. I'll go through some key results, and then we'll try to grapple with some of the policy and theoretical implications near the end. And I guess I'll also say, I very much welcome clarifying questions throughout. There'll probably be a couple points where I'll stop to maybe get a little bit of feedback. Now being in a business school, I feel uncomfortable talking for much more than say, 10 to 15 minutes. So it'd be nice to have some conversations throughout. Yeah, MBAs don't, they very much like to hear themselves talk. They don't really want to hear me talk about. So let's go ahead and start with the kind of theoretical background and theoretically how we're thinking about this process. I guess we think about college admissions as a kind of particular instance of this more general phenomenon that we're calling competitive self-presentation. And I guess I should start by kind of breaking that down. So self-presentation generally is the way that we translate or how we present ourselves to others. And this is a ubiquitous process throughout society. But importantly, since the classic work of Goffman, folks have examined and started to theorize around how individuals in many different parts of the social life do this strategically. And so in this kind of literature, the kind of paradigmatic example is, say, I'm at the water cooler at work and it's Monday. Depending on who asked me what I did that weekend, I might present a different story of what I did, right? So if somebody who's also a parent asked me what I did, I might emphasize the fact that I went to the park with my 2-year-old. Versus if somebody who doesn't have kids ask me, I might emphasize the cool concert or the opera that I went to that weekend instead, right? And so this is done strategically. Often what they're thinking about in this literature is how individuals do this in a way so that the self appears more favorably to targets. And so it's a kind of project of mentalizing how others are going to evaluate different ways of presenting the self and strategically selecting how to present the self. And importantly, this is kind of a process where culture meets agency meets structure. So it is a very fundamental sociological process. Is a way, if we think about that process of trying to take on the perspective of the other and presenting oneself in a positive light, that requires some amount of cultural capital. And so if the distribution of cultural capital is different across identity groups, for instance, we might expect that process to look different for those groups. And also thereby it's a site of social disadvantage. And so we know that individuals in different identity groups, for instance, racial minorities, face penalties through this kind of process. Like this is a site where some of those inequalities are reproduced. Now, when we're talking about competitive self-presentation, we're talking about a particular version of this, a kind of subset of strategic self-presentation that involves this kind of explicit comparison of different individuals' self-presentation done by an organization. And so we get a kind of fun set of interesting other dynamics. And let me actually just go ahead and skip to the kind of broader theoretical diagram. So this is our kind of general take on competitive self-presentation, how we think about it. These are the different kind of pieces and how they relate to one another. And so, for instance, in our case that we're examining today, we have students who strategically produce, for instance, essays, other components of an application. And they do that strategically so that as they submit it to an institution or organization, for instance, a university, when they go through the process of evaluating it via, say, a rubric, they hope to gain some kind of resource that the organization distributes, such as a positive admission decision. But when we start laying it out in this very kind of general theoretical framework, we can also think about how, for instance, workers submit cover letters to businesses, researchers submit proposals to NSF, where they talk about, for instance, how they're an expert in this particular field and how they have the methodological and theoretical chops to carry out this project successfully. And these are done strategically so that when the organization does this evaluation of all the different self-presentations that have been submitted to it for a scarce resource, they'll end up receiving the resource. So I guess any questions on this kind of framework? This is the first group we're kind of pitching this to. So any kind of feedback, things that are confusing about it, literatures you think we should be talking to, but that you're not seeing represented on this slide, would be certainly helpful. Yeah.
Just a small thing, but I feel like, in some cases, like admissions, maybe the case that these rubrics are hidden to applicants.
Yes.
In other cases, they might be visible, and just exactly the way you laid it out here, it feels like it's obscure, but there might be other situations where, applicants are directly presenting themselves in anticipation of a rubric or something that they know about.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think we could imagine different kinds of setups. And I think college admissions is interesting, right? Because in principle, the rubric is not made public, right? And I think generally in these kind of settings, like if you have a reasonably rationalized organization, they typically aren't making these things public because I think there'd be, worries about gaming the rubric, whatever. I think that's kind of an interesting, idea in itself. But I think that's kind of the logic of not making these rubrics public a lot of the time. But
in the case of like NSF and ranking,
yeah, no,
I'm thinking like I've written NIH proposals with people who have sat on so many study sections that to some applicants, like the rubric
right.
is more known and to some they're less known.
Yeah.
It's the competition.
Yeah, I guess I'll just say real quick. So I feel like with like the admissions essays, for instance, it's interesting. We started to have to develop the rubric for this.
Yeah.
And we started searching, and then we kind of very quickly arrived at what we think would be common categories on the rubric and like the grading criteria. And then we did a lot more digging. Like we started talking to people in college admissions, we started having conversations with them back and forth. And those categories didn't really change. So in roughly 30 minutes of just searching casually on the internet, we pretty much arrived at what is a very common rubric. So I think it's interesting. It's not made explicit, but yeah, it is also quite knowable, and that could vary across, for instance, groups with different resources, et cetera.
It's
Paul.
exactly like the sorts of cultural inequality that you've been talking about. You, of course, are an expert in higher ed, so you can do it in 30 minutes, but most people can't. But I read somewhere that some incredibly large proportion of applicants to four-year colleges now have college advisors. And presumably these people make it their business to know the rubric.
That's
To
right.
have somebody who knows that you're not advised by somebody who knows that would be a source of equality.
Yeah.
Well, the college advisors in the sense of like, if my daughter went to a big public high school and she had a college advisor, but the worst is like paid kind, like.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it also varies a lot with the schools, and a private school is three for every student. In a big public school is one for every 10,000 students, plus parents. All sorts of other. Sorry.
No, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and so I think with this kind of framework, we can start thinking about that. I think one other thing we were thinking about as a group is, I think this is true, certainly in the context of college admissions, that we start thinking about like the funnel into STEM, for instance. Like there's also this interesting loop where once these resources are allocated, that shapes, the applicant pool for some next, site of competitive self-presentation. I guess, one of the things is we're trying to think about what's a kind of universal structure. And I think that's like a particular thing that's true of maybe even a lot, but not all of the kind of cases. But, so we are kind of working on, that's something to for sure keep thinking about.
Maybe an extra step in
Yeah.
between the applicants and the production of the self-presentation, then sort of information gathering procedures you're looking at. What is the cohort you're trying to replicate or conform to, or what are these rubrics, or what are these sort of institutional knowledge about with these?
Yeah, I mean, that information can look really different, right? So we could even just think, in here is something around just, knowledge of a US culture enough to know that if I pick out a random person who's highly educated, they'll like this particular writing style versus another kind of writing style, or knowing like what the linguistic norms are. Like you think about the information very broadly, or you can think about it really specifically of like, you know, I had so AJ, for instance, was at one point in his career a college admissions, what word did he use? Consultant. So he like knows this stuff inside and out too. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I'll think more about the information there. I think that's great. Okay, so then if you think about this general process, like what we're kind of interested in is somewhere in this process here, we're now getting the introduction of generative AI, at least as a tool that individuals may or may not use. And they may or may not use it based on several different factors, right? For instance, it may be availability, but it could also be things like there could be a kind of more repugnance to using generative AI to do this task, right? They might think that it's kind of inappropriate. We had some folks, for instance, in our experiment who, you know, refused to use generative AI, and they, you know, told us so in the open-ended comments that they thought it would be inappropriate to do so, even though this was like a contrived experimental setting. And so then you would imagine those individuals would probably have similar concerns about doing it for real college admissions. But so once we get the introduction of generative AI into this kind of arrow here, we can start thinking about the consequences for all the downstream parts of the process, right? So we can think about, for instance, how that affects qualities of the self-presentations that are generated. We can also think kind of at a systems level about the diversity of self-presentations that are generated. We can then also think about how organizations respond to receiving these altered versions of self-presentations. By altered, I mean like in a counterfactual sense. We can think about how that shapes the evaluation process, but also the evaluation outcomes. And then, of course, we can also be interested in how that changes the allocation of resources towards, for instance, different identity groups. So we can start, you know, analytically thinking about that, laying out the hypotheses. These are all, I mean, shortened versions of the pre-registered hypotheses. I guess one thing I'll point out is you'll see, like, for instance, that we have like the positive effect, the negative effect, and the null effect. So we pre-registered, you know, doing a equivalence test here. And for some folks, they think that's like cheating. I don't know, which I don't know. I just have, I mean, I guess I don't have that perspective. You know, I think some of the best social science is one where one theory posits one direction, another theory posits another direction, and you're pitting them against each other. So like I'm all for doing that. You know, I think the nulls can be a little trickier. You have to be well powered enough to like give some bounds around the null that you can provide evidence for. And so that's why we only have it for hypothesis one, because we're gonna have the best power for that. But these are kind of generally, you know, we'll go through the results, and so I don't think it's too important to like go through each of these. I will just generally say we're going to have, at this point in the analysis and data collection, we're going to have kind of the best purchase on hypothesis one. We'll have like some very preliminary stuff on hypothesis three, and hypothesis two, like yeah, I mean, I'll get to it, but I think we have we're the least ready to speak very definitively on that at this point. Okay, so let's start talking about the data and methods. So these are the kind of questions we're interested in. How are we going to try to address this? And our basic idea here was to set up an experiment where you can kind of imagine it either as simulating the counterfactual for individuals of whether they have or do not have access to generative AI as they're writing these college admissions essays. Or you can think about it, and sometimes we'll think about it this way, as kind of simulating a version of the world where everybody has access to generative AI, or a version of the world where nobody has access to generative AI. That was kind of the goal of this experimental setup. This is going to involve 3 different sets of data collection. We are, I'll share over this intermediary slide. This is out in the field right now, so we don't have access to it. I'll still talk you through it so that you kind of understand how we're thinking about this. But so we have three different surveys we're running, we call them, or survey experiments that we're running. The first is the author survey, the second is the evaluator survey, and the third is the expert survey. So the author survey was responded to by current US college students we recruited on Prolific, which is the academically geared sample provider. They wrote college admissions essays with or without the assistance of generative AI. I'll show you what that looks like in a second, but so that's randomly assigned. All the folks here besides, so both authors and evaluators were financially incentivized, and authors were told that there were going to be college admissions officers who reviewed their essays, and if they reviewed them as being of high quality, they would receive an additional financial compensation. And so we're trying to kind of set up the parallel to actual college admissions, that there is actually a resource at stake here in terms of the quality of the essay. So after individuals wrote the essays, after we collected all the author data, we then put the essays into pairs. And the pairs were constructed such that one individual in the pair was in the treatment condition, one individual in the pair was in the control condition, and both individuals identified as the same race. So we have a kind of within race across condition pairs. Then we showed these pairs to our second sample, the evaluators, who were also recruited through Prolific. They are folks who have a postgraduate degree in the kinds of fields that professional college admissions officers have degrees in. So this would be things like education, but also things like history is actually a reasonably common one. And we, did this through both AJ's kind of domain knowledge and also talking to folks who work in admissions. Each evaluator was shown one essay pair, and they were provided a rubric. Then they were asked to select which in this pair was the better written essay according to the rubric. So they're kind of making the admission decisions in this kind of simulated setting. They were also incentivized. They were told that the professional college admissions officers would be shown the same pair they were being shown. And then if they made the same decision that the college admissions officer made, then they would receive an additional financial bonus. This was to kind of try to get them to be taking on the perspective of a college admissions officer and to kind of take the task seriously. And so in that sense, the analyses that I'm showing you today are all, I guess we could call them incentive compatible in some sense. And we also had them do this incentivized guessing game, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But basically, they were told, or they were asked to kind of make bets about characteristics of the authors of the essays. If they were to guess correctly, they would gain additional monetary bonus. Our last wave of data collection, which is in the field, is taking a bit longer than we had hoped, is the experts. And so we recruited a set of people who are current college admissions officers for undergraduate, higher education institutions. They were recruited both through personal networks, and we actually put up an advertisement with, I'm gonna forget the name of this organization. It's like the NACL or something like that. It's like the Professional College Admissions, like it's their organization. They go to the meetings every year. That's where all the hotshots, go, etc. And we were able to kind of post an advertisement on their job board, and we were able to recruit several folks through that. I mean, we weren't sure how many we were gonna be able to recruit. We ended up getting 10. Which, makes some of the statistics a little tricky, of course, but that's why we also have the evaluators that kind of triangulate there. I will say I was really happy with the diversity of institutions we were able to get. So we have across public, private, R1, non-R1, religious, non-religious institutions. So I actually think we ended up with quite a good kind of I shouldn't say representative, but a surprisingly diverse cross-section, I guess. I'll say like that. So any questions about the data collection before? Yeah.
I'm going to get to this, but two questions. On the authors,
Yeah.
these are folks who use Prolific. I don't know anything about Prolific.
Yeah.
So that means they have Wi-Fi, they're not likely to be on computers. Are you worried about inferences to a wider population of people who fly?
Yeah. So are the folks on Prolific representative of college students in general? I think it's certainly a limitation of this. I think, one of the things that our kind of mantra here is what we're going to be adding to this literature, right, is the fact that we have this really internally valid experiment.
Yeah.
And there's going to be some limitation of external validity. We think we made some reasonable trade-offs. And so we do worry about that. And so specifically, you might think that these individuals are better able to use generative AI than the typical college student, for instance. And so that might suggest maybe larger treatment effects than we might observe in the broader population. Would that be your concern as well? Yeah. I think that's totally reasonable. Yeah.
And second thing on the evaluators, roughly what would be the incentive?
Oh, sure.
Roughly.
Yeah. So evaluators, I think it was around 750. So we found that it took them about a half hour. So this was very long for a prolific test, which I think is part of the reason we ended up knocking the sample size we had hoped on the authors. Turns out college students don't want to sit down for a half hour and write another college student essay.
Yeah, a lot.
Yeah, well, yeah, we tried upping the incentive for authors twice, so we have that fun thing to deal with in the robustness checks at some point. But the evaluators, we didn't have any trouble collecting them. We got as many as we wanted. And I think it was about $7.50, and they had the possibility of earning an additional $1.50, if I remember correctly.
Coffee.
With what?
Coffee.
Not even.
Yeah, I mean, for a half hour, you know, so we, you know, I always definitely set my rate, like, I would never pay below what I think the federal minimum wage should be. And then from there, I, you know, say it's like kind of market rates, like they were clearly very happy to do it at this, like, you get pretty wide variation in how long it takes people too, but
Just for the guessing game?
just for the evaluators, yeah. So
No,
it's
no,
for,
but extra, because you've got two things you're incentivizing them to do. One is to match the expert evaluation, one is the guessing game.
yeah, so $7.50 for the whole thing.
Right.
And then they could get $1 if they match the guess of the experts. And the guessing game involved 2 sets of guesses for the 2 essays, and for each of those, they could have earned up to 25 cents. Oh, yeah.
Of
No,
that,
no, please.
relative to, but did you have any trouble getting that by IRB?
No, why?
They didn't, because it's so much. I've run into problems with them before where they're like, you're paying them too much, that's
Oh.
coercive.
Oh, interesting. No, yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The IRBs are like very, you know, and the institutions I connect, they vary a lot.
Right, right.
And I mean, I'd say that IRB and MIT is like, it's interesting as long as you know, fit the criteria of, wow, I can't believe I'm blanking on this word. You know, it's like excluded or exempt, thank you. Exempt research, it's just a, you know, an algorithm, you click through some boxes, and then you get an automated approval, which is crazy. I mean, I had to talk with another assistant professor, I'm like, this doesn't feel like okay. It's like, will you review this protocol and agree with the like decisions that I made here? Yeah, Paul.
So probably, you know, I might use to say I have to do the IRB process, but.
Yeah, it's not even AI. It's not even, it's a, you know, do you confirm that, you know, this data is identifiable or de-identifiable? I said it was identifiable because people are writing the autobiographical essays. And then it's, do you think that would they likely, you know, suffer some kind of professional or health, you know, risk if the data was released? And so that I had to consult with a colleague, but we ended up saying no. And so then it's just like, from there, you're good to go. So,
That's it.
yeah.
So I think my intuition is that you're actually better off paying them $1.50 than paying them something that would be an actual financial incentive, because the $1.50 is enough to gamify it, making it a game that's going to motivate them. If they actually think that it might be enough to be a financial motivation, they may question whether it is or wonder if they can still, you know, so I think probably that was the right decision in making it really low and marginal. But one question about the others, I have a feeling, I mean, well, hopefully my characters do this, but on a bad day, I might be tempted to use one of my existing college admission essays, not write a new one, created from college.
Absolutely.
Is that something that you would address?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll show you an example essay. It's one that, I mean, I think it's interesting because as I'm like going through a random set of 50 and making sure I like have some exposure to what these essays actually look like, it's one of these where I was like, okay, I think this person probably, so this person was in the treatment condition, or maybe actually, I'll skip ahead to this. So this is one of the essays that was written. It was one of the highest quality essays if you look at the distribution of quality scores. And I immediately was like, this person in the treatment condition, probably, my first guess was generative AI just wrote this for them. Like they just typed that prompt, which is actually okay in our experiment. We actually think of that as like a feature, not a bug, and something that we can examine. But we have the full chat logs of them interacting with generative AI. And actually from that, and we also have keystroke count and time spent writing the essay, that does not appear to be the case. This person seemed like actually talked to generative AI, asked it for tips on how to write it. It like she asked for edits as she went through. And so that was not the case. But I was also worried about her having gone to like a previous college essay that she had written and just like writing that in. That also appears to not be the case, again, given that we can look at the keystroke counts in our conversation with generative AI. So we can do that kind of check for compliance. I'll say specifically to that point, we, at the end of the survey, we ask folks, you know, we have this kind of self-disclosure question. We say, we promise this will not affect your compensation or your ability to earn a bonus, but it's critical for our research to know if you used any of these additional resources in writing an essay. And one of the options on that was previous essays you had written. And very few people at least disclose doing that. We have a set of other, things we can kind of look for that for. So again, like keystroke count. And so if individuals like, if this is like 5,000 keystrokes, whatever it is, and it was exactly 5,000 keystrokes to get this written out, then I would be suspicious that they had already kind of written it out somewhere else. And that would make you think maybe it was a previous essay. We haven't done the full dive yet into the compliance checks, but it's something we're very mindful of. Yeah. Is that, yeah. Or do you have any other thoughts on? Okay. Yeah.
Can you, with the evaluator step, I'm just curious, something that strikes me for admissions is that there's a difference between like who clears the bar and then these like actual admissions decisions that's a committee might make under resource constraints.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if like there was any prompt for those evaluators to think about that, or, those just feel like such different things. Like I'm guessing that in admissions offices, there's just a large pool of people who they say, okay, we think we can accept these people. And then they're constructing a class or something, and the actual decisions are made independent of whether somebody fits the sort of general rubric or criteria.
So yeah, if it's independent, if it's completely independent of say the rubric they have,
Yeah.
I think it's a little more tough for us to square.
Yeah.
I would say, I guess I in general expect that to be at least strongly correlated still with admission decisions. Like I would think, and I mean, the conversations, so we're doing like background kind of interviews with folks who work in like college admissions for different undergraduate institutions. And sometimes the story does get a bit more complicated than that, but we're still generally hearing like, they're like these professionalized, they're like this occupation. They at least like to think they're doing like quite, suited, like somewhat scientific work here, like where they're creating this rubric that they think is going to, get in the students who are of the highest quality. Sometimes there's like an element of like deservingness or opportunity. Sometimes, so there is often an element of like cultural fit, but that's baked into the rubric, for instance. So they do try to include all the things that they think are important. And they do, at least from the few interviews we've done so far, it does seem like if they think they have to deviate from the rubric for some reason, that's like a shortcoming of the rubric and something that should be fixed. And so there certainly would be a question of, how many are we admitting? But that, I think, my sense to them is that that's roughly like we're rank ordering on the basis of the rubric, if there's that kind of constraint, and then we're kind of chopping off there. But there are certainly going to be organizational idiosyncrasies, and our experiment's not going to be able to really, capture those for sure. I think you had.
I was gonna say something, I think you kind of indirectly answered my point, but maybe like a way that you could imagine framing this is there is a big difference between like the large state school and like the private elite.
Yes,
undergrad
yes.
things.
Yep,
And I
yep,
think
yep,
the
yep,
large
yep.
state school, it's much more like, do you clear the
No,
threshold,
that's
yes
right.
or
That's
no?
right. That's right.
And so then if you get that critique, maybe that's something you can lean on,
Yeah.
whereas like when you're admitting like 4,000 people at Dartmouth.
Yeah.
I think there is more of like, well, like on some level, the rubric is like less defined, say, and there's certainly more like I think there's more complexities with it, whereas like at the large state school, I think there's more defined. Like, do you pass this bar, yes or no?
Yeah, and we will do an analysis. We have a version, I can show the appendix slides where we're thinking about different kind of admissions cutoffs, right? Where if, we're thinking like a Harvard wants to admit about 5% of applicants roughly, right? Like, or if they're kind of shooting to have that kind of exclusive rate of admissions, and versus like a state school who ends up, accepting like I think some of the higher numbers are in the like 80th percentile, 88% or so. Then we can look at like the effect of generative AI across those different cutoffs, which I think is interesting. We're not seeing a lot of movement on that, which I think is, tells us something. But yeah, we're mindful of that. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So you said it's been about half an hour of the evaluators on task.
Yeah.
Is that typical? I can't imagine.
Oh, that's a good
anyone
question.
applicants
Yeah.
spending, people.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, what the evaluators do is not quite, it's not like, they do things that college admissions officers aren't doing, right? So college admissions officers have access to all these other parts of the application, right? This is just the admissions essay. But also like college admissions officers are like given all this background information. We're like asking them to guess at this information that the admissions officers would have. So it's not quite apples to apples in that way. I guess I'll say this is, 2 applicants, so I guess the average of 15 minutes per applicant.
But also like these people don't do that for a living.
That's right. That's right.
Like I know this year when I did our master's application, it could go like 5 times faster than when I did it
Yeah.
the first time 11 years ago.
Yeah.
So,
And so, yeah, it would be interesting to compare maybe the evaluators, the experts. We have timing on every part of the essay, so we could compare how much time evaluators spent reading the essays for the first decision, how long the experts
Yeah,
spent.
many of us have done graduate revisions now. And
Sure.
without any of it, and any year, 15 minutes.
I think that's fair, yeah. Yeah, maybe if they were financially incentivized on each individual decision, maybe they would, maybe. Yeah,
Just one more question on the recruitment of the authors.
yeah.
Did you ever consider to recruit the ones that are before their college admission and are about to write their essays compared to the ones that already have experience? with
Yeah,
it?
so I had 2 reasons. First, very practical. The second, more, I'll call it theoretical, but you can judge that for yourself. So on the practical side, that means we're dealing with minors. So then the IRB does get more complicated. On the more, more scientific justification, like one of the nice things we liked about going for current college students is that we can ask them for self-reported GPA. So we're starting to get something around like, huge scare quotes around quality, but something like what the college admissions officers think they're doing, like if they're able to admit a full class and all of them excel very much in their classes, they think they've done a good job. And insofar as they're admitting people who don't do well in the class, they think they've done a bad job. So we get something at like, I don't know, accuracy is not perfect, but like, the effect of this across different levels of like applicant quality. So I think that's a nice thing. We also get variation in the like rankings of the colleges that they're currently in. So we get some nice things, by doing this on college students, but it would be very interesting to also do this amongst high school students. Yeah. Okay. So I'm noticing time-wise, I'm a little farther behind than I thought I would be at this point. So let me kind of push through some of this. I think given the kind of engagement in the room, I think we're kind of understanding a lot of the details of the design. So I think I can go relatively quickly through that. We used a prompt. The thing that the authors wrote about was actually a prompt taken from Common App. It does kind of emphasize like things like stories and identities and stuff. So that kind of is kind of aligned with some of our theoretical interests, but it really could have been any Common App prompt. This is what the treatment condition, the actual treatment looks like. So they end up on this page, they have the prompt in front of them, they have a text box, it's showing them what their current word count is. Essay needs to be between 250 and 650 words. And the treatment condition, they also have this, chat assistant at the bottom that's just GPT-4o mini. It's willing to do whatever. A lot of people did just copy and paste this and ask it to write the essay. That is something people did for sure. And again, we take that as a feature. As I said, some people refuse to do that. Some people refuse to use it at all. Some people did medium ground where it was like, give me tips for writing an essay on this prompt, etc. And so this is like what the treatment is. I will say one other thing we had to do, we discovered in pilot testing, we need to do something to increase compliance. And so we do also have this difference, which I think is like our biggest kind of weakness in this design, was in order to promote the use of the chat assistant here, we need to allow copy and paste for treatment, and the control condition to disincentivize the use of external generative AI tools. We disallowed copy and paste. And so it is in that sense like a double barrel treatment. I'm fully transparent about that. It was a very tough decision to make, but we just got such low compliance rates in pilots where we didn't do that. We just had to implement it to be feasible. Yeah.
So here's the other side of that argument.
Yep.
So if your compliance checks are based on keystroke and things like that, so wouldn't that disable your ability to see non-compliance in the control? Because now you don't, like, let's say if I use Generative to generate my control essay on the control group, I can't copy paste now, so I do it and then I just type it in. I see all the keystrokes, it's gonna take me longer, it may make it look more like an authentic essay.
Yeah, we're doing more of the compliance check of, is your,
I think it
is
does,
the
it's where it
keystrokes.
forces compliance, but then you may evade.
Yeah, so the compliance check is not so much is the number of keystrokes under the length of the essay, although that would be obviously a silver bullet, in some ways. What the check is it exactly the keystrokes necessary to produce the essay or slightly above it? Because if you're writing it in here, you should be needing to do some editing, etc. And so we're actually more looking for that. We also have time spent writing the essay, which is another thing we'll try to do a kind of soft compliance check around. And then we also have the self-disclosure item at the end of the survey. So we're trying to triangulate across those three, but yeah, point taken that in the pilots, that was one of the things that we could look at with a lot of people had like one keystroke for a 500 word essay. So
Why 3.5?
why? Oh, it was 4.0 mini. Sorry if I misspoke. But we tried a couple different models. Like 4.0 mini was like vastly cheaper than like the next tier up, and we didn't see real returns. It was one of these things I was nervous about what happens when we start scaling it, how much is this going to cost, like, and I think we ended up spending like $3 in that whole experiment. So I'm like, I kind of wish we had just gone with like whatever state of the art was, and it probably would have been fine. But I was like very hesitant about that. Assistant professor first year, I don't want to like end up in debt.
$1,000.
Yeah. But yeah, so 4.0 mini, like I said, we tried out some of the more state-of-the-art stuff, and it to us didn't seem noticeably different on pilot testing. Yeah, I showed you guys the example essay. Yeah, just for time, I'll go through this very quickly, but if it doesn't make sense, let me know. We're basically gonna have kind of two ways of analyzing the kind of decision or evaluation data. We're gonna have a kind of paired version of the analysis. And so then you can kind of think about the data as being like repeated measures on the evaluator, where we have one treatment observation and one control observation, and we can take the difference of those at the evaluator level, and that's kind of where our outcome is.
So in effect.
Yeah, I mean, like it's literally a lot of it's literally just a paired sample t-test where we're taking like kind of two observations here, or you can take the difference of them and do a one sample t-test. Yeah, when we do regressions, we could do like a fixed effects like per evaluator, or we could do like a random effects, or we could do clustered standard errors. When we're looking at the applicant of the observation, sorry, I'm not sure that quite answered your question, actually.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's basically, one way of doing fixed effects with paired data is just to deviate or just subtract one from the other.
Sure. Oh, yeah. So yeah. So that's like functionally like we take these two applicants, they evaluate, take the difference in the quality score, and that ends up being like one. Like
you're also
DB.
controlling for presumably other characteristics.
So because we randomly assign treatment, like, there's a counterfactual where we just assign treatment to the other one, we think of that as, like we don't need to include controls to get like LP values.
Right, so I would say just from a variance perspective, pre-treatment as you can.
Yeah, so if we need to do like author control, we'll typically go to this like individual level, where or maybe I should call it author level, because individual is not very meaningful here. But so here instead we have a data set where each row is an applicant. Then we have like the quality they received and the condition they were in. There we can also include like their GPA, self-report GPA. We can include like their gender or their class, whatever, other controls or moderators we want to include. And there, in the model, anything I'll show you, we haven't done the cluster the standard errors because we're still in the first bite of the apple stage, but obviously we should do something to account for the kind of clustering there for sure. We just don't have that yet. And then yeah, definitely don't have time to go through this in full, but we'll also be doing some like the degree to which we can predict some outcome from the text and the essays. And I kind of have a procedure that I argue for when we're doing this kind of theoretically driven like prediction problem. I have a chapter where I outline kind of the method for doing that. Basically, if you're familiar with machine learning, it looks like leave one out evaluation. Basically, the idea is we're going to train the machine learning model to predict the outcome on the basis of the text and the data on kind of n-1 observations to produce this out of sample prediction for one observation. We'll repeat that across all the individuals. And then what we end up with is being able to, for instance, calculate the accuracy or the correlation between the actual observed outcomes, say it was like what condition they were assigned to, and then what our prediction is based on the text in the essays. And sorry for going through that super quickly, but hopefully that's reasonably clear. So kind of outline for results, and no, I'm running short on time, so I think I've done enough prep work to where it'll be fairly easy to go through these. So does generative AI influence essay evaluations? The kind of takeaway here is generative AI does help you write better essays, but I think if we were to pull like people's priors, it may not be as much as you had thought. And so in those pairs, right, under the kind of null where generative AI doesn't help you at all, about 50% of those pairs, the treatment essay should have been picked, and 50% the control essay should have been picked. Instead, we see the treatment essay was picked 60% of the time. And then we can look at a 1 to 100 overall quality score that evaluators gave each essay, and we're seeing a treatment effect of about 6 points. So You could think that that's relatively small. I guess one thing I do say about this though is, that when my kid applies to college, I would much rather them have a 60% chance of getting in than a 40% chance. And I guess I'll also say we do see a lot of variation, across the 1 to 100 scale. Some of that's coming just from variability in the authors, of course, but also variability in the evaluators' kind of baseline expectations. So, we're seeing a treatment effect of the Cohen's D, I think ends up being between 0.2 and 0.3. So it's actually like, social science terms reasonably large. But then we also had folks give a 1 to 100 score on each of the rubric criteria. And yeah, definitely don't have time to go through each of those, but I guess I'll say I had kind of mixed expectations for which of these we're going to see positive treatment effects for. I thought things like voice and tone, we might see a negative effect or maybe a null effect on. And if you have similar expectations, I'm here to tell you you're probably pretty wrong on that. And we're seeing that as generative AI is helping on every single rubric criteria. So those authors who had access to generative AI also wrote ones that had more like impact and authenticity, like some of these more soft criteria, but also had higher scores on things like writing mechanics that you might expect. Does generative AI influence evaluation disparities? So here we're looking at, we're clear with this in our pre-registration, like we want to evaluate these more on the expert data, on the expert ratings than on the evaluator ratings. Nonetheless, the evaluator ratings is what we have right now. So we could do things like look for heterogeneous treatment effects by racial identity. Maybe looks like, white applicants are receiving a little bit less of a bonus. None of those are statistically different from each other. Obviously, you shouldn't overinterpret the null. And again, we really want to do this with the expert data anyways, but we're not seeing the kind of stark heterogeneous treatment effects you might have expected coming into this. Also look by income. So this is income deciles for family income that individual self-reported. And so we can look at the kind of treatment effect of the difference between these two lines across all the different income categories. I'll also say these are not linear regression line fits. These are low S lines. So just that's to say these are flexible and it could, dip around and go to, up and down, but it's just finding a very linear kind of relationship. And I guess the takeaway for me is maybe there's some slight, slope there, but really these to me look like very parallel lines. What that means is that if you find that those are parallel, that means that at each income bracket, individuals are getting this consistent bump of having used generative AI. And so if you were concerned, for instance, that folks who are from high income backgrounds are going to gain this huge advantage and individuals from low income backgrounds are going to gain no advantage, the data is not looking to be consistent with that.
The opposite concern.
Yeah.
Which is
Oh, okay.
giving your actual data that you're getting rid of people who would most benefit from AI. And if you have sample.
Yeah, and I'll say, the survey we were already kind of pushing up against what are norms on prolific, and it was literally the next question on our list. Like, if we had an extra minute, we would include how much experience do you have with generative AI?
Well, I mean, every study I've ever seen shows that AI has a much bigger effect on lower quality.
Interesting.
I mean,
I've seen some stuff like coming out of finance, for instance.
This is work. This is not school.
Sure.
Workers.
Yeah.
Most benefit is from these.
Yeah, I'll say there's some evidence from like finance professionals that actually folks who have the most knowledge are able to most effectively.
Okay, yeah.
So yeah, I think there's mixed, I guess in this domain, we're not seeing that at least. Yeah, right now. And then does generative AI influence what is written? I kind of explained the kind of this, this is a financially incentivized guessing game. This is what it looked like. Folks were asked this question, they had to distribute 25 points across. Yes, they had access to generative AI. No, they did not have access to generative AI. If they made the right guess, there's a chance they could have got 1 cent per point put in the correct category. Again, sorry, I'm going quickly through this. And so there's a question of how accurate were these folks? We can analyze it at least 2 ways. One is on average, did they give more points to treatment essays than control essays? They did ever so slightly. The mean difference here is less than 1 point out of 25 possible points. We can also then kind of binarize this and say which did you put more points into yes or no, and then we count that as like a hard guess, and then we can make a nice confusion matrix of did folks tend to guess correctly. That would be higher proportions in these diagonals. And so we show that, and we're finding that 54% of the time evaluators are accurate, which is significantly different from 50%, but obviously just barely. So my takeaway from this is, if folks are confident that they can tell generative AI from non-generative AI, that's not strongly suggested here. Of course, we also do need to do the compliance checks, to probably adjust this. I will say though, like, we have one of the professional college admissions officers, but this is not their data. But when we get that back, if it looks similar to this, it'll be interesting. We had one college admissions officer, when they emailed us to say they'd be interested in participating, they said, but I should warn you, I'm really good at detecting generative AI. So we'll see how they do, but they certainly expect, I think, to have higher than 54% accuracy. So then we can also do, with the kind of prediction layout I outlined earlier, we can do kind of random forest given kind of word frequencies in the essays, do prediction, and that does just a much better job than the human. So this is, all these predictions are just done with this particular n shown underneath. These are the size of the different subgroups. So it makes it a little hard to compare across, because it may look like we can predict like white applicants using generative AI more than say Asian applicants, but it's hard to tell because the models aren't trained on the same number of examples. We need to think about how to deal with that in a better way than we do here. But I think best row to look at is probably this overall. So this is when we put all the data into one pool. Like we're getting 85% accuracy in predicting whether folks are in the treatment or control condition. Note also that there's non-compliance, and none of that's corrected for here. So that's quite high in my opinion. Whereas the humans were like just above the 50% mark. Okay, and I'm probably over time at this point. Yes, I'm 4 minutes over time. So really quickly, I guess. Okay. Oh, right, that's right. Okay. Yeah, I guess I don't have to say, yeah, that's a good point. Thanks for reminding me. So I guess one thing I want to emphasize here is, okay, obviously we have a lot more to do, and we are having, I guess, like follow-up projects we want to do. This immediately raise other questions for us. But right now where I'm at, if I had to make a single recommendation, where I'm at right now, and Daphne was pushing me on this, which I appreciate. But my kind of provisional recommendation is, it looks like we have not found a kind of source of heterogeneity in treatment effects, right? Which would be a big concern for the proliferation of generative AI on, say, admitting folks just on the sole basis of their quality, whatever you think quality is. And so the biggest risk to the kind of decoupling of admission decisions and kind of this whatever quality you're trying to seek because of generative AI comes from differences in access. And so here we're imagining the world where everybody has access or nobody has access. We're actually in an in-between version right now where not everybody has access and not everybody has access to the same model, right? And none of that's accounted for in the results here. But that leads me to think that, for instance, if you're doing admissions, you should probably provide access to a model that hopefully you can get all the applicants to use. So that everybody's kind of put at least on even ground in terms of the model they have access to. We have other analyses we want to do before we feel really solid in that recommendation, but just as I'm talking to you guys, that's kind of where we're at right now. I guess also in terms of generative AI detection, we're interested in this more from a research perspective than a policy perspective. Like I think, the false positives here is they're very costly, and so we should be very cautious about this. But I think for research purposes, automated text analysis provides a really interesting possibility for kind of detecting the use of generative AI in, say, real college admissions, which we're getting access to right now. And it provides an interesting path forward for us for research purposes. And then I guess just on a theoretical level, we are seeing that even when folks have access to this technology, which most people think will help them, some individuals do refuse to use it, but many individuals do embrace the opportunity to use that technology when engaged in competitive self-presentation. We of course have limitations, which I've talked about, lots of asterisks here for sure. Let me talk to you quickly about where we're kind of going with next steps. So first, we're kind of interested in what happens after admissions. Like, one of the big questions we have with this saying just give access to generative AI to all students. One of the problems that you might imagine is the folks who get in because of some unobservable or something, like the folks who get in might still be different in some way, such that those folks who get in might not be able to succeed, after they've been admitted. And so we're going to try to start to triangulate that question or start to address that question by getting access to archival data. Where we have access right now to one college and one university's full administrative data and all their admissions data. And so we're hoping we can start to get some purchase on that. We're trying to get access to a couple other schools' data as well. I think that could be really interesting. I think there's some like more fundamental questions about communication in generative AI. And so for instance, one of the things that we did is we asked the authors to look at their essay and select passages they thought readers would find especially compelling. And then we had the evaluators highlight passages that they did find compelling. And so we can start to like look at the overlap there. And I think one of the things that we're interested in is does that degree of overlap differ by use of generative AI or not? And so I think there's some more fundamental questions about human communication to address there. Also, because we have all the chat logs of folks who are in the treatment condition, we have just endogenous differences in strategies that people deploy, right? So some people just asked Gen AI to write the essay. Some people had a more involved co-authorship relationship. And so we're hoping that maybe just qualitatively even, we can kind of create a typology of these different strategies and see what's a more effective strategy compared to others. And I think one of the things that's been really interesting in the background kind of interviews we've been doing for this is the kind of organizational response. So we were, for instance, talking to somebody who heads up admissions to a graduate program at a prestigious business school in the Northeast. And they're kind of locked in this intense cat and mouse game with admissions. So they, for instance, they were concerned about the use of generative AI in written essays. So they're starting to lean more on these Zoom interviews where they'll be with an applicant and they'll give them the prompt and they have 30 seconds to prepare in their head a response and they have to just give the response there on the spot. I think it's interesting for two reasons. First, I feel like just globally, that's like a worse admissions procedure. Like I think what you select for there is probably a worse thing to be selecting on. Maybe not for certain professional programs, but I think generally it probably is. The second thing is that now they're saying they're starting to see people, what it looks like to them, they're reading off of a screen, right? So they think that now people are typing that into generative AI, getting the response, and then reading it. And so they're locked in this cat and mouse game where, at least in my view, it seems like they're just worsening their admissions, process more and more to try to catch this mouse that, like, realistically, they're probably never going to catch. I think it's a losing race, and I think it's a losing race in two senses, in that they're not going to be able to stop generative AI, and they're going to make their admissions process worse in the end, anyways. And that's it. Thank you guys so much.